Hey, it's your old pal Lucid Stew again. This time we're going to talk about another sculpting technique called cloning and layering. We're going to take a look at Enchanted Woods by Brian Taylor 60 because it features a specific brand of this technique. Brian Taylor is excellent at using this technique, and he came up with the name for it. Big thanks to Brian for all his hard work, letting me use it in my video here, and also coming up with the name for the technique. I've gone into this tranquil scene and started ripping things apart to see how they're put together. These mossy trees are made up of mini sculptures. Let's take a look at the mossy branches first. Now I'm firming these up with the sculpture detail tool to get an idea of the original shape, but I likely could have done the same thing by turning looseness down on the sculpt. Those mossy bits are a bunch of spikes, probably curved tool shapes, and those present a scattered form when you loosen them up. If we take a look at the trunk, we see where the term cloning and layering comes from. This look is achieved with two sculpts, an underlying form that is fairly tight, and a clone of that which is loosened and then layered on top for added texture to the form. Here I've increased sculpture details so you can see this is basically the same form, but it looks like we might be using a different fleck type. And then you can see the difference in impasto and looseness settings. Brian Taylor 60 was very gracious about this production. Among other things, he sent me these pictures of an unpublished scene of his where he uses this technique to get the look of a sticky, kind of settled snow. Another good example of this technique by Brian Taylor 60 is Cyber City Scene. The approach to level design here is interesting. Most of what you see is a single sculpt used in various different ways. The sculptures look solid but are covered by a grime of loose flecks. Initially I thought these were painted on, but as we'll see in a bit, these are cloned and layered sculptures with looseness turned up. We're going to walk to and stand next to the sculpt that makes up most of this scene. Here it is. This is a tighter version of the sculpt. Let's take a look at how things in this scene are made from that. I'm going to grab this big piece here and lift it out of the scene so I can rip it apart. At first glance you can see a few clones of that small part, but how is the rest of this made up of that? The larger parts are pretty obvious, but look at how the smaller parts are the same thing, like the caution stripes. Even this glowing piece is the same sculpt. I've taken one of the larger sculpts out of the scene so I can rip it apart. I'm ungrouping to reveal two separate sculpts and then pulling them apart. These appear to be identical with looseness turned up on one. If we drop that to 0, it looks like they're the same shape underneath. If I turn the looseness way up and drop it back into the scene, you get a slightly different look, kind of like giant cobwebs. You can do a lot with looseness in this way, like in this scene, Dreams of Underground by Sayanisu 50. I'm not sure if there's any layering here, but some looseness added to what would otherwise be a typical scene makes it look like the whole place is old and dusty. Back to our technique, I've done something similar here to create Autumn Tree. If you scope in, you can see the canopy of the tree is made of two nearly identical sculpts in two different fleck types and spray painted a little differently. If you want to see how this was made in more detail, follow the card above. I used the same technique in Flowering Tree to create a tree canopy with one sculpt covered in the dots fleck type. And then a hollowed out shell of that sculpt using Impressionist fleck type and spray painted white with some purple dots for flowers. And when you combine them, it looks like a tree covered in flowers. Lastly, I'm going to use this technique to show you a quick, easy way of covering a wall with ivy without having to be an artistic genius. First of all, I'm going to copy this wall. Then I'm going into style mode so I can change the fleck type of the copy. Now for leaves you have several choices, but in my opinion the best fleck type is splat. Dots is also really good. It just depends on the exact texture you're going for. In this case I'm starting with dots and end up changing my mind later. After I apply the fleck, I want to go into the sculpt menu so I can change the color. There are lots of different ways you can do this. Play around with it, explore. But one of the easiest ways to recolor a sculpt is to change the color in outer properties to roughly what you want. You can do the same in inner properties, but sometimes this isn't necessary. And then back in outer properties, move the hue slider until the sculpt becomes the color you want. This is very green, but you can always fine tune it later. For ivy, we want a lot of impasto, so let's turn it all the way up. And then we'll dial up looseness until it's roughly where we want it. So this is a pretty good result. Let's put the two back together. Doesn't look too bad. It's a little thin and dainty in my opinion, so I'm going to change the fleck type for a more robust leaf appearance. As before, we go into style mode, choose splat for the fleck type, and then apply the fleck to the sculpt. The leaf structure is better, but it's thinned out a little and I think it's too monochrome. So I'm going to copy it one more time. After a certain amount of overlapping copies, you start running into rendering issues, and it can get a little gameplay thermo expensive, so the visual variety you gain may or may not work in your scene. That's your call. All I'm doing with this copy is a little recolored toward yellow in outer properties just to differentiate it from the green we already have. The two combined looks pretty nice. You can do additional work if you like, such as spray painting vines on the original sculpt. That's all for this time. I'll be busy with school the next couple of weeks, but I will return to making videos after that, so I'll see you next time.